week before last, and he said, he said, what would you do to solve the problem of knife crime in estates in South London or across London? And he just said more sport. Do you think he's right?
I think it's certainly one of the solutions, and I think particularly with the challenge with knife crime and sort of gang-related sort of violence, is there an alternative for them to go to? And I think part of the challenge is in many instances there isn't. And I think there's been a particular challenge there with some of the decline in youth services, for example. So there are less opportunities for young people of that particular age to get involved with, and they will find other things to get involved with, or they will get dragged into those types of things. So I think, yes, sport is definitely a solution. And actually, we're talking to another charity at the moment about that's something that we might be supporting. And certainly we know that we've got schools on the programmes that we run. The head teachers want our programmes because they know it will mean that their young people are not on the streets at the end of the day, so therefore they can't get into trouble. And therefore, just by virtue of doing that, it improves their life chances.
Do you think that that culture and sports programmes they're more than just diversionary tactics? Is that actually there's a way in which young people can engage with them because of their intrinsic interest in them, which can then give them a new direction?
Yeah, fundamentally, I completely agree with that sort of statement. And the work that we do is not a diversionary tactic. It's not just about the young people doing sport because it keeps them off the streets. What we actually believe in is the model that we work with. It's intensive coaching and mentoring through sport. And young people will be engaging anywhere between maybe 2-3 hours, maybe up to 15-20 hours a week. And what they're able to do through that is to get the additional developmental opportunities that goes with sport. So it's not just about the physical literacy. And coming back to your sort of original question, about is the value of sport, recognised enough? I don't think it is, and that's possibly because it has such a narrow sort of definition in many people's minds, or the natural perception of sport is just about physical literacy. It's not. There are a whole other load of benefits that go with sport around sort of individual development and sort of mental well-being and social cohesion. All of those things come through sport when it's done really well. And what we see with our young people is that sport becomes something they engage with. It's fun to start with, you put some sort of good coaching and mentoring around it, and then they learn new behaviours, they learn to think differently through that, and it's by doing that it creates new opportunities for them, and essentially that can change their life chances.
Yeah. Obviously you're in a very different position to Darren Henley because he gets given a amount of money by the government. Always a big debate about whether that's enough or not, but you're a Greenhouse, a charity that has to go out and raise funds. Yeah. Do you also bid for public money to support projects that you're doing, and if you do, how do you find that process?
So yes, we have bid for public money, and we have also received public money from Sport England. So we've had money over the last 3 years that supported our school programmes. And then we've also had some capital funding that also supported the sports centre that we've just opened in Marylebone. What I would say though is that as a charity we're quite unique. So 90% of our funding comes through private sources, so sort of trust grants, foundations or corporates, and then only 10% of our funding has come through sort of statutory side. And that's because we found it easier to access funding through corporates and private sources rather than through Sport England. I think interestingly, because we've been having these internal conversations, if we wanted to grow as a charity, we think we would need to be able to access more statutory funding. But with all of those other challenges that are going with Sport England around, let's say, falling sort of national lottery ticket sales, actually that funding isn't as accessible as it probably was in the past.
The final question for me before bringing the other members in is, Matthew Say's been very critical of Sport England. I don't want you to sort of jeopardise your future funding opportunities for Sport England, but do you his criticism seems to be that it is not outcomes focused enough as an organisation, that it distributes funding, but there's not enough focus on what the effect of that funding is. And I'd be interested if you want to make a comment on that, and also why it is that is one of the reasons you've maybe had a relatively small amount of your income has come from funding bodies like Sport England. Is that because your programmes don't comfortably sit with the sort of work that they fund?
Yes, I think if I just take that sort of last question first, because one of the challenges that we found historically, and we've only had sort of 3 years of funding from Sport England to date, was our focus is a very intensive intervention. So we tend to work with lower volumes of young people, but actually the intervention itself is life-changing for them. So we know from research with Loughborough University that a young person on our programmes is likely to spend 8 days less truant a year. And will get better grades in progress and attainment in maths and English, and also there will be better behaviours. So therefore we're lower volumes, and actually I think historically Sport England have probably been focused more on high levels of participation, which for us is quite light touch and is therefore not making that sort of life-changing intervention that sport could make. So I think that's probably one of the things that Matthew was sort of commenting on within that article. I think also part of the challenge, or maybe one of the challenges he focused on was, and maybe Sport England has now changed its focus, it's become much more focused on sort of mass participation and broader outcomes, and actually looking at the social benefits of sport rather than just the physical activity or elite sport. So there's been some diversion of funding going across from not going into elite sport, but actually then making that more accessible to others, albeit it's a smaller funding pot overall. So I think there have been some changes within Sport England that have maybe sort of started to address some of the points that Matthew's made. He was looking at sort of a long-term piece, in terms of has Sport England actually had a strategic effect in terms of getting more people more active, sort of more often, and actually we're just seeing that having plateaued at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Joe Stevens.
Thank you, Chair. You said that you got 90% of your funding from private and corporate donors, don't you? What incentives are there for them to make those donations?
So there's a range of things actually, and if we looked at trusts, grants, foundations, it'll very much sort of be tied in with the core mission of whatever that sort of foundation trust might be. And what they're looking for is that we do something in terms of defined outcomes and that we're able to prove those, and therefore they will support us with funding. So that's quite straightforward actually. You're just looking there to see that you've got an alignment in terms of what our core mission is and what their core purpose is. Then you move on to corporates. Corporates actually, I think, are changing in terms of the way that they're looking to fund or the reasons for funding. I think historically, and we've benefited from this, there were a large number of corporates that would give just donations, and actually they just wanted to see that you were doing something with the money. I think now the way that corporates are working, it becomes much more strategic in terms of the way that they're thinking. So it becomes about maybe their customer groups. Actually, they will want to fund stuff or fund projects that are linked to maybe their sort of core market. And I also think there's a third dimension, which is they're now starting to see, working with charities, and CSR as something that's important to their employee engagement strategies. So I think it's actually becoming harder to work with corporates for that reason, because we have to do more. Essentially, you have to create more volunteering opportunities for them to get involved in the charity, which is actually not a bad thing, because that creates capacity for us to then work with our young people or to help with our centre and to work with challenge events, those types of things. So the position's changing.
So what do you think there are any other incentives that the government could provide for corporate donations, just that don't operate at the moment? So around, I don't know, maybe tax or advantages or anything else?
I would have thought something around some tax advantages would definitely help in terms of making sure corporates wanted to support those types of areas. And again, you've then got to convince the corporate that actually, or you've got to have an alignment, I suppose, with what it is that they're looking to have an impact on. And that's probably going to relate to their core market, but actually things like tax breaks would undoubtedly make it a lot easier.
Yeah. And in your experience, is there a notable difference in the quality of the sporting programmes that are funded by public money and those funded by private money?
I've seen no distinction between the two actually, because what you tend to see is actually the charities or the organisations that are running the programmes, they will run a programme of a particular quality, and then they're able to tap into different funding sources. So I can't say that I've seen a particular distinction.
And going back then to public funding, you mentioned about national lottery ticket sales falling and the difficulties around public funding. What's your feeling about the legacy from the 2012 Olympics in terms of what we thought the legacy might be and how it's actually turned out to be?
It's an interesting question, and I think, and this is our sort of personal take on it, sort of greenhouse sports. We felt there was a bit of a pregnant pause, and it sort of lost momentum immediately sort of post 2012. And I think that was because the government strategy didn't come out until after the Olympics, and then the sort of the Sport England strategy. So therefore there was just a delay, and there was a focus on probably club level sort of sport and sort of MGB. And I think people were hoping for the momentum to come on the back of the gold rush effect, shall we say. But it isn't just about the gold rush effect, it's about community sport. And yes, Olympic athletes are inspirational, and yes, you see an increased uptake in sport like cycling and hockey. But actually, you've got to make it work at the grassroots level. And if you don't make it work at the grassroots level, and you don't put the infrastructure, you don't have the frameworks, you don't have the outcomes, then actually you haven't created that enabling environment. And I don't think we created that enabling environment quickly enough, basically. I think now with the new Sport England strategy, and now the focus on broader society, or basically social outcomes, we're now getting the focus back in the right place. But it's taken us a while.
And do you think that gap that you've described means that it will ultimately be less successful than it would have been had it been done, straight on the back of the Olympics, and there hadn't been that delay?
I don't necessarily think it'll be less successful. Maybe it just takes longer to get to the end point. Right. So it just becomes more incremental. But I think we've just got to recognise where we didn't quite get it right, and then it's important to learn from that, and then you can then basically put the investment in the right places, or change the strategies or the policies, to make sure that things start to join up. Another particular point, I think, and I'm not sure this has been addressed yet actually, is there has been a lack of joined up thinking across different government departments about the wider social benefits of sport, for example. I'm sure my two colleagues would say exactly the same thing, because what we see is some very siloed thinking within sort of different departments, for example, within sort of education. And actually sport is to a degree dropping off the agenda within education, rather than sort of increasing, and that you get an increased focus within DCMS, which is great, but actually the two should align, and they don't. So there's lots of opportunities, I think, to create more joined up thinking around sort of policy and strategy, to make sure that those start to come together.
Okay, and my final question, obviously you're London based,
yes.
And our two other witnesses are English based, and we've got a couple of Welsh MPs on this committee. How much work, if any, is done across nations in the UK? I mean, so do you have work with anybody in Wales, or are they all kind of in silos operating now?
No, we work with a range of charities. So we don't work outside of London, and the reason for that is because we particularly focus on a very intensive coaching and mentoring model. So we work with about 7,500 children a year. So we work with a lot of young people, and other charities might be national, that sort of scale, but our focus is very high quality, very intensive, and multiple outcomes. And
all those children will be from London?
And all those children will be from London, and from disadvantaged communities as well. We only work in areas of community disadvantage. But what we are able to do, and something we're doing more of, is to start sharing best practice with other charities. So we're talking with lots of other charities about the stuff that they're doing and the work that we're doing, sharing our Loughborough research. We're just about to do another phase of our Loughborough research, to start looking at the links between sport and employability skills. So we're talking to 2 or 3 different organisations about how we might work in partnership to do that piece of research. And also talking to Sport England, actually, because they can play an important role within this, which is about then sharing that best practice across the sector.
Okay, thank you very much.
A quick question from Rebecca Powell.
Is there any question, picking up some of the points about the strategy and this changed formula for sporting policy? How important do you think it is? I know that there is well-being is one of the 5 key outcomes. How important do you think it is, and how do you think we could get tackling obesity for young children into that? And do you think it's important that we should make that a priority? Surely people doing the sort of work that you do could really help.
Yes, so I'm definitely going to agree with you. It's an important issue and we should be tackling it. And we're working with local primary schools actually around the Marylebone area, where some of those schools have a particular challenge around sort of childhood obesity. So it's something, yes, it should be an absolute focus, and that is one of the key things to be able to do with sport is to get the engagement early, because you want the behaviour change very early. So working with young people, children in primary school level, and getting them into that sort of habit of sport and physical activity is the most important thing, actually. So there have been some good initiatives that have come on the back of that. So we've had the sugar tax levy and sort of the sort of physical education sort of sports grant for primary schools. So that is helping young people to stay more active, particularly in the primary schools level, and that will help.
Are you actually seeing that? Because we're told, isn't it, 1 in every 7 children or something is obese, you know,
yeah.
by the time they actually even get to school. I think that's correct me, that's not quite the correct statistic, but it's a horrifying statistic.
It is a lot, yeah.
In fact, I think it's higher than that, actually. I suppose 7 out of 10 or something. You know, it's a horrifying statistic. So it's not working yet, whatever we're doing. So how urgent? I mean, it is urgent. And are you making it an urgent priority? Because we've already tried all these other things, like let's talk about doing some more sport at school. We actually need to have a really set plan for it. And is the government and the way the sporting policy works, is it helping?
So it's something we're trying to tackle by working with primary schools, because we know it's important and the primary schools know it's important. I think the issue is when it comes to government policy and Department for Education potentially, is yes, there's been an increased focus by putting more money in through from the sugar tax levy into primary schools, but it's quite a short-term intervention, and actually sport within schools, for us, we're seeing it sort of drop down the priority agenda, so the focus is very much on the academics. Now, the way that we view the child, as I heard mentioned earlier, is the whole child. We're looking at the wider development of the whole child, and sport becomes a part of that. But because sport has effectively been sidelined slightly, albeit there's more money gone into it, it just becomes a discrete part of what's being delivered. And actually, there's no real hard outcomes from the school's perspective in terms of that they're held accountable for around things maybe tackling childhood obesity. So I think there's a challenge there, and that's where I talk about joint government thinking. You know, could that be something that somebody like Ofsted have to take much more interest in when they're looking at schools in terms of what are the school strategies around tackling that sort of thing. And then I also think in terms of looking at the long term, because the sugar tax levy is a short-term intervention, and it's not all schools, but many primary schools will be using part-time sports coaches who will come into the schools. So effectively they subcontract the delivery. My concern there is over about 2 to 3 years, as they subcontract the delivery, because it's the most effective way for them to deliver it at low cost. Actually, they're going to lose that capacity to deliver it themselves when maybe this grant or this additional funding starts to go, and then that's when you'll have the real problem.